Okay, guys. So now that we have our Google sign-in, we have to actually figure out how to store this authenticated user into our database. Because right now, the authenticated user that we're getting back from our auth library is not actually something in our database. So when we actually sign in with our Google sign-in, what we get back is this user authentication object that has a lot of properties on it that we don't actually want. So there's so many properties on this because a lot of these are related to things that you might want to do with a Google Auth object from Google's own API. So this is supposed to integrate with many of their other services or what they offer in their Google sign-in to other platforms, other libraries. It's all unrelated to what we need in our application. In fact, the only things that we really need in our application is this display name, this email, and possibly maybe a phone number, right? But the most important thing is this UID. This UID represents the dynamically generated ID string that Google made for us when we authenticated this user using the Google sign-in. In fact, if we go into our authentication and we look at our user, inside of our auth tab, whenever a user signs in to our application using the auth library that we have, regardless of if it's email sign-in or Google sign-in, we will get this user, right? And this user has this UID. We have to take this user auth object, figure out the properties that we want from it, and put it into our database. Particularly what we want to do is put it into our users collection. Now, we're going to write some code that will allow us to do this, as well as understanding what the Firestore library actually does for us, because there's actually certain rules or certain things that we have to abide by in order to use and update the Firestore database. And I'll explain them as we write out this function. So the function that we're trying to write is going to be one that allows us to take that user auth object that we got back from our authentication library and then store it inside of our database. So what we're going to call it is this function called create user profile document, right? And this is going to be an asynchronous thing because we're making an API request, right? That's an asynchronous action. So we're going to call async. And what we're going to pass into it is, of course, our user auth object, right? That we get back from the auth library. That's that same object that we were logging right here. We're going to pass that in. And then we're also going to pass in possibly any additional data that we might need. So this could be something that we're going to use later when we do our sign up. But for now, we're just going to say we also might want some additional data that'll come in the format of an object. And I'll show you what we'll do with this additional data. Now, as we saw when our user signs out, we actually get back null from this library, right? If I were to sign out right now, we'll see that we log null. So we only want to perform this save to our database if we get back a user auth object, which means that they signed in, not that they signed out. So our function has to make sure that we're checking if we're actually getting back a valid object. So inside of our code, what we're going to do is we're going to say if there is no user auth, right? Because this will evaluate null, right? And if it's null, then it's false. And with the bang, we're going to say we want to reverse it. So if it's not false, right? So I know that context is confusing, but this is essentially us saying if the user auth object does not exist, then we want to return from this function. We don't want to do anything else. We want to exit from this function. If it does exist though, what we're going to do is we are going to query inside of Firestore for the document to see if it already exists. Now, in order for us to do this, we have to understand what it is that we're going to get back. Now, inside of here, I have an actual slide for us to understand. The Firestore library gives us back one of two different types of potential objects. We either get back a query reference or a query snapshot. They're both different objects that do different things in Firestore. But let's talk about what a query is first. A query is simply us asking Firestore for some document or collection. If you remember from the last lesson where we talked about Firestore, we called .doc or .collection and then passed that string to the location inside of the database, right, for either a collection or a document. That act of asking is what a query is. And what we'll get back when we query is a query reference. And it can either come in the format of a document or a collection if we're querying for a document or collection, respectively. But Firestore will always return us these objects, whether it be the reference or the snapshot, which we'll talk about later. Firestore will give us the object because using the object, we can determine whether or not there's any data there. Now, the reference is simply an object that represents that current place in the database that we're asking for. So let's actually try it out, and we can call it either using .doc, passing in the collections this way, right, or .collections and passing in the path to that collection. We explored that earlier in a previous lesson, but let's try it out. What we're going to do here is we are simply going to console.log the Firestore and then calling for the doc, users, / and then a random user ID. One that we definitely know doesn't exist, right? Because our collection is empty anyways. If we were to save this and pass this into our app.js, right? We import it in and we use it whenever we get back an auth object. We know that this will be asynchronous because we're going to, of course, make a potential API request, right, to our Firestore. And then what we'll do is instead of setting the state here, we are going to we're just going to fire this using our user auth object that we know that we're getting back from our auth library. If we were to save, we go back to our application, we see that we're getting back this document reference object. We also see that the random ID that we passed to it is here. We see that we get the path that we also passed in, right? So we know where the current location of this document reference is. But we are always getting back this object, even though it doesn't exist inside of our database. So why is that? Well, the reason is because we actually use this reference object to tell Firestore whether to save data to this place inside of our database or to get data from this location in the database. It does not have the actual data related to the document. Instead, it gives us properties that tell us details about it, like the ID and the path to this specific query reference, as we already saw. But what we're also able to see, if this is a query reference, right, meaning it's a document reference, is that the parent is a collection reference representing the collection that this document is in. So here we'll see in this collection reference that we have our ID of users and the path is just users. Now, the difference between the document reference and the collection reference is that the document reference object we use to perform our CRUD methods on our Firestore. CRUD being either creating, retrieving, updating, or deleting the data in that place, that location. Now, when we actually retrieve the data, right, we're calling .get, right? And .get is us pulling out a snapshot object of that place in the database. And that snapshot object was that second type of object that I was telling you that Firestore could give us back. We'll actually use it and we'll be able to use that snapshot object in order for us to determine with our code whether or not there's any data in this current reference in our Firestore. So I'll show you what that is as well. But again, the snapshot object we get back from calling .get, right? So we either call documentref.get or we call collectionref.get. Collectionref also gives us back a snapshot of the collection, but it's different from what we're going to use in our current code. But it's just good to know that this is something that you might possibly have to do. And of course, from the document ref, we're going to get a document snapshot. So let's actually take a look at that. So back in our code, what we're going to do here is we are going to move this into a const of some kind, right? So const user ref equals firestore.doc, getting that user. And then I'm going to here say, how do we get the snapshot? Well, it's going to be snapshot equals user ref, right? So we have our user reference dot get. Now this is an async, right? So we're going to await this. And then we're just going to log the snapshot. So we take a look at what it is that we're getting. Now we see that this is our document snapshot object, and on it is this property exists. The exists property tells us whether or not there's any data there. The ID tells us, of course, the ID of the same document. Metadata gives us certain information about things like when it was created, right? Whether or not it's cached, whether or not there's pending writes, meaning if there's anything that needs to be updated, right, to this snapshot. Don't worry about this for now, but just know that this is something that you might want to use if you get really, really deep with Firestore. And then, of course, we can also always reference back to the document reference object that we queried our snapshot from. Now, instead of using this fake one, what we want to use is the user auth UID, right? Because we now want to see whether or not the user auth object that we get back from our authentication library actually already exists in our database. So here, we're able to say, instead of using an actual string, we'll use string interpolation, and we'll say users at our user auth.uid. We will get back the user reference at that location, and then we'll get a snapshot. And using that snapshot, we're going to figure out whether or not there's data there, right? Whether or not we've already stored this user object that we've authenticated. And here we'll see that the exists is false, of course, right? But the ID is now that ID that we were getting back from our auth library. So what we're going to say is we're going to check inside of our code, right, using that snapshot exists property. So if it doesn't exist, we want to actually create a piece of data there. And we're going to create it using our user ref. Because if you remember from our slide, in order for us to create, we have to use the document reference object, not the snapshot. The snapshot simply represents the data. Any methods of creating, getting, updating, or deleting that data, we have to use the document reference object for. So here, what we're going to do before we create it is we need to see what properties we actually want to store, right? What are the data that we want to use in order to create this actual document? So what we want is the display name and the email from our user auth, right? As we remember from that giant object that we first logged, we want the display name, we want the email. And we also want to make sure that we know inside of our database when we made that document. So by calling new date, we're creating a new JavaScript date object that tells us the current date at the current time when this was invoked. And what we're going to do is we're going to wrap this inside of a try catch block, because what we're going to do is an asynchronous request to our database to actually store this data now. So what we're going to do is we're going to await our user ref calling .set. .set being the create method. And we're going to make an object, right? We're going to pass in an object where we have the display name, we have the email, we have the created at, and we're also spreading in any other additional data that we might want. So as you remember, I mentioned earlier, we're going to pass this additional data into this function as an object. If this has any issues, we're going to console log error creating user, right? And then we're going to log out the error message as well. And if this snapshot doesn't exist now, we'll create data in that place. That's all this code is doing. We're checking if there's any data in that place. If there isn't, create a new user using the data from our user auth object. Now, what this function will also do is always return us back our user ref, because there's a chance that we want to use this user reference object to do other things, right? This code simply creates the snapshot. It creates the data, but we might still want the user reference in our code for something. So that's why we're going to return it from this user ref. And now when we call to create user profile document, right, our app initialized, you see we didn't log. So we probably created something in our database. And if we check, there is our user in our database. Our current user is now being stored. And if we refresh, as we know, our function will fire every time because auth is always persisting. Despite that, we've only still got the one user. We're not making multiple copies because our code again checks if the snapshot at this place exists or not. So that's what our code is doing. We're checking, and now we're making these new users inside of our database based on that user auth object. And now that we have these objects being stored in our database and being pulled into our application, let's actually figure out how to store this data so that we can use it in our application.